Hello friends, my name is Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about Loki, if he is a true pagan god or the representation of the Christian consciousness. I'll focus on the mythological accounts for this subject and the way Loki was represented in literature. That was how Loki was presented to us, and the true pagan past of this god is still obscure, and we can only come up with a few ideas on the true identity of this deity and its pagan roots. Loki is a key character on the universe of the Norse mythology, but his characteristics are far from a Norse pre-Christian view. The Prose Edda is still one of the best sources we have to understand Norse mythology. However, Snorri Sturluson, who wrote this work and for the first time put to parchment the myths of the Old Norse religion, was an Icelandic politician of the 13th century, and he was also a Christian. The Prose Edda isn't the only work about the Norse myths, but what it has in common with all the other medieval sources is that the majority of the works about Norse mythology were written by Nordic people who lived in an era already far from the pagan past, and in a way they already saw the Norse myths with a certain temporal and cultural distance, because they were Christians and things had changed a lot for at least 6 to 8 generations. As I've said before, Norse mythology has a lot of similarities with a Christian view, because it was indeed influenced by the religious realities of medieval Europe. But it's up to us to try to filter and divide the pagan view from the Christian one, so we can better understand what exactly the religious influences were. Now going directly to the god Loki. Loki in the myths that have reached us is introduced as an intelligent, deceitful, malicious figure. His adventures always have a selfish and egocentric structure. Loki always intends to take advantage and gain something in everything he does, with devastating consequences sometimes. Throughout Norse mythology, we see that his behavior is only getting worse, bringing more and more chaos and sadness and destruction. Loki never gives great importance to his actions, even when he is the cause of someone's death, indirectly or directly, and he is constantly threatened by the gods or other beings who put a price on his head. He created a lot of blood feuds. People want to take his life as a payment for the evils he has done. In the myths, he is also presented to us as an evil and spiteful deity, and in addition, vengeful. Seeing Loki from this perspective, we begin to realize that Loki is a strong representation of Christian values and morality, as portrayed in history. Once again, we must not forget that Loki is a character in a story by an Icelander who would expect social retribution for misdeeds, so it's perfectly normal to see Loki being tortured and pay for his actions, and that payment sometimes is indeed very humiliating. As I've told you before in other videos about Ragnarok, it is a story with great Christian influences, and Loki plays a major role in the catastrophic events. Combining natural events and collective fears with a distant pagan memory and the new religious ideas of the newly Christianized Northern European societies, we have the perfect ingredients to create the story of Ragnarok. So Loki was presented to us in the same manner. All these factors influenced the medieval Nordic writers, and Loki seems much more related to a Christian consciousness rather than a pagan deity. Then we have Loki's children, and the way they were portrayed also have clear Christian influences. The wolf Fenrir, the exact opposite of balance, killing and eating Huden, the symbology of fear, of chaos devouring order. Jormungandr, the world serpent, which in a pagan perspective, the serpent that eats its own tail and envelops the world, was a symbol of protection and also the representation of the constant cycle of life, death and rebirth. But in the Norse myths, Jormungandr is seen as an evil being, really similar to the serpent of the Christian consciousness, an animal which also represents the devil himself. And finally, Hel, the goddess of the underworld, who is portrayed as a decaying, monstrous figure. In fact, all of Loki's children are portrayed as monsters, fantastical beasts of the medieval Christian consciousness. Loki's children represent Christian fears, vices and sins, and also the beasts that dwell in the infernal realm of the Christian mythology. When the sons of Loki were begotten, they were already foreshadowing what would happen in the final apocalypse. Here we see similarities with the figure of the devil in the Christian universe. He also creates monsters that attack the soul of humans and that will wage war against the forces of God. Let's not forget that Loki was expelled from Asgard and imprisoned, building within himself a great hatred for the gods, and when the day of Ragnarok comes, he and his children wage war against the gods. This is exactly what happened to the devil, expelled from heaven, building a great hatred for God and all heavenly creatures thereafter. And in the end, he wages war against heaven and brings his monsters and fights against the archangel Michael. Loki also fights against the guardian of the gods, Heimdall. So in a simple review, let's see. Loki's children are monsters, and it is foretold that such beasts will bring the doom of the gods in the Great War, where Loki plays the key figure of invasion and chaos. The devil creates monsters and uses them against the forces of heaven. Loki is expelled from Asgard, the Norse representation of paradise. The devil is expelled from heaven. Loki nurtures a great hatred for the gods. The devil nurtures a great hatred for God and all heavenly things. Loki in Ragnarok fights against Heimdall, the guardian of Asgard, and both die. The devil in the apocalypse fights the champion of heaven, the archangel Michael. The medieval works are excellent sources to understand Norse mythology, and without them we would have little or close to nothing to know about the Norse gods. But we can't deny that Christianity was already deeply rooted in the social minds of the Northern European societies, and the writers of the Norse mythology unconsciously and also consciously made a mixture between the old pagan memories with the new religious reality. So Loki is without a doubt a very interesting and obscure figure, but also without a doubt he was the god that suffered more Christian influences than all the other gods. This fact leads people to believe that Loki isn't a god as old as all the other gods, because it seems clear that he was a figure created by Christians. However, I must disagree on that, because Loki appears in the myths as much and sometimes more than all the other gods. In fact, he shares adventures with lots of gods, and he seems to be as famous as Thor, Freyr and Huden himself. And this shows us that in the pagan past, Loki must have been as important as all the other gods. In fact, his importance must have been indeed great, because he survived Christianity and appears in almost every single story. Now, obviously, we see the importance of gods when we see their names still printed in locations, or the name of objects linked to the gods. Thor and Freyr, for instance, there are loads of names of places, locations and objects related to these deities. But when it comes to Loki, there are absolutely no traces of his name, and if it wasn't for the Norse myths, we would think that Loki never belonged to the cultural and the religious universe of Scandinavians. And this only reinforces that indeed Loki is a Christian character, but again, I disagree. In every country where Christianity spread, they made sure that people there would adopt biblical names, and many places were baptized with new names from the new religious order. And if Loki represented so much the figure of the devil in the Christian perspective, I can bet that Christians worked very hard to wipe out his name from every location, objects, and probably even from people's names. I will not speak about Lucifer in here. I'm afraid I would extend this video too much. Maybe I could make a video solely about that, who knows. But the representation we have of Lucifer in the Bible and the one we have of Loki is very similar. Both are beautiful to behold, physically gorgeous, very wise and masters of deceit and trickery. Both are shapeshifters and both are associated with fire and also knowledge. In a psychological view, both Loki and Lucifer share similar characteristics. Even in the end of times, both Loki and Lucifer are defeated and a new order will be installed after Ragnarok, Judgment Day. In conclusion, this Norse god suffered great influences from the Christian religion, and there was a great inspiration in the devil. But on the other hand, in a more profound analysis of the Norse myths, and if we take into consideration the pagan view of our Norse ancestors based on archaeological evidences and the remnants of pagan celebrations and rituals, Loki was once a pagan deity with great importance and represented the very forces that exist to maintain a balance between order and chaos. Also, I do believe he was a representation of fire, for his name is very similar to another character, Loki, which means fire, flame, the giant who is the impersonation of fire and represents primitive fire. But Loki, on the other hand, isn't primitive fire, he is something else related to fire. Loki is wildfire, while Loki shares the same characteristics of fire, and all his actions are like a fire that seems under control, but at a certain point it's out of control and consumes everything that it touches. I think Loki was the representation of civilized fire, the fire we humans could control, which brought warmth, protection and knowledge, but at the same time, in the wrong hands, or if you didn't keep an eye on it, it could be devastating, chaotic, disastrous. It could both bring benefits but also maleficence. So there is always the need to control fire, the very action that creates balance, and by constantly working to keep that balance, we continue to use fire to our benefits but also to destructive effects, like a controlled fire in agriculture. You use it to devastate the land, but on the other hand, it will help to fertilize the soil and brings new life after the destruction, just like Ragnarok. Chaotic events of fire and destruction, so a new cycle of life can begin. Alright friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and by no means I think that Loki is indeed a character from the Christian mythology or created by the Christians. I do think Loki was indeed a very old god and very important representation of fire, knowledge, and I'm sure that before Norse mythology was written into parchment in the medieval ages during the 13th century, before that Loki was obviously very different from the perspective that was given to us in the written records. So once again, I hope you have enjoyed this video. See you on the next one, and tack för idag!